Measure that there. So, my name is Fertessa Allyse, and you might see Fertessa Scott, but I go by Fertessa Allyse for board game design, so don't be confused. I figured that I would start off just kind of introducing myself while people come in, and then I will get started on the topic. So, like I said, I'm Fertessa Allyse. I'm a game designer in Georgia, and I will hopefully be in Seattle pretty soon. I have two games that have been signed: Book of Villainy, which is signed with Goldseal Games, and Wicked and Wise, which was signed with Weird Giraffe Games. And currently working on a third game called Mansplaining. I am a blogger for Girls Game Shelf, which is a really great group of women who do how-to plays and teach me how to play your game on Twitch, as well as a bunch of other different streams and reviews and just cool stuff. So check them out. And I'm also a copy editor for rulebooks, and I've been picking up freelance work for that as well. Let's see. All right. It looks pretty good. So today I'm going to talk about how you can identify bloat in your games, and how to let go of those things that are causing the bloat. Because I've noticed that while playtesting a lot of games, it helped me kind of see patterns and see how easy it was to become attached to a thing. And, designers, myself included, will be really inclined to justify why something is there, or tweak something to try and make it work when that thing might not necessarily be benefiting the game anymore. And the right set of questions can make it a lot easier to kind of switch up your perspective and see that it no longer works for the game, despite why it was initially put in. So today I'm going to go over 4 questions, which is: why did you create this mechanic? Is this mechanic controversial with your playtesters? Is the current version doing what you wanted your previous version to do? And also, is there a better way to achieve the original goal? I'll also be using examples from my first game, Book of Villainy, because, like I said, I fell victim to this as well. So, and if anyone has any questions, just feel free to type them, and I will get to them as soon as I can. All right. So, let me switch over to my huge view, and bear with me. This is my first time hosting the Facebook Live. Switch over. Wait a second. Bear with me because I did that before I was ready to switch to the right tab. Here we go. There we go. Now we're there. Okay. So, this was Book of Villainy, and it was the very first game that I worked on. And while working on it, I had to develop a lot of different things with the board and the movement and the characters, and it transformed quite a lot. This was, where did it go? This board to the bottom left was probably the second iteration. This board in the middle with the purple and the gold is the very first version of Book of Villainy. And as you can see, it slowly evolved. I still use very abstract shapes. I definitely stuck with these squares. But one thing that didn't change for a long time was a character I created called Superfleek. Let's find him. He's right here, but I think we can find a better picture of whenever I first created him. So I created a character in my game called Superfleek, and before I even had a drawing for him, I had the idea that I wanted this superhero who was going to be the nemesis to the villains in my game. So my game Book of Villainy is about villains, or excuse me, at the time it was about villains who were trying to collect a Book of Villainy, just one singular book, and they were going around the board wreaking havoc. And there was this one superhero who was called Superfleek, and he was supposed to kind of be the AI on the board that created those gotcha moments for the players. That's why I put him in there. And just so you know, yes, he's wearing pants. He is wearing pants. I realized much later that it was not clear, but he is wearing pants. So I created Superfleek, or I had a friend draw Superfleek, and I'd seen the warnings, don't commission art, and I thought it was fine. I was like, it's $50, it's a friend, this is a great idea, it's hilarious. But I was already making a mistake. One, because I invested money in it, and that just, no matter what you say to justify it, it makes you more attached to it. But two, before my friend even made Superfleek, I was in love with this character. I had written an entire diary post because on BGG I keep my work in progress diary, but I had written an entire post describing the background of what should be a game mechanic. But I was like, Superfleek is going to be this hero in town, and actually he's a villain because you have to bribe him, and he's only a hero because he can fly. And he can only fly because he eats so much pizza that he farts all the time, and it keeps him up in the air. So it tickled me, and I made Superfleek, and he stayed in the game forever. Forever. So, like I said, my first mistake was I paid for Superfleek. But my second mistake was I became super attached to him before I actually tested what he did in the game and what he brought to other players. It was really kind of about what joy he brought me being in the game. As I iterated, Superfleek changed several times. In fact, I wrote them down, and he changed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. He changed 11 times. Let's see if we go back to the image gallery here. Okay, so, and let me check to see if there are any questions. Oh, okay, you can't see my screen. That's terrible. I was talking this whole time and you can't see my screen. Can you see? Okay. Bear with me. Can you see it now? Nope. Okay. Well, it worked before. Oh, there we go. Alright. You guys can see the screen now. This is Superfleek. Thank you for that. So again, all of what I said relevant to this being Superfleek. Alright. So the next thing was the iterations that I made. When I started, again, it started with the very simple shapes, kind of a Monopoly board. and Super Fleek was a pawn that was on the board, and I had him kind of set to automatically move around the board, and if a player got caught in his flight path, then they would be bumped into this center prison area. Then he evolved so that players could control him, because I was like, okay, he's not very interesting right now. Players can easily avoid him, and, you know, he's not really doing anything, but they think he's funny, and I think he's funny. So let's just change it so that players have the ability to control him, and that way it should make things more lively. So I gave players pizza, little pizza tokens, and in theme, the pizza would be enough to motivate Super Fleek to move in a different direction. That still didn't work. It was clunky. So then we moved on to changing his backstory. We said, instead of just being a superhero, he's now a villain who doesn't know he's a villain. And now, instead of knocking players into the prison, they are forced to go to Super Fleek's mom's house where they eat pizza, because he's like the guy nobody likes and he just wants to like hang out. And so you're like stuck in Super Fleek's mom's house, which was a space on my board, until you could get out. So what I was doing was I was forcing players to interact with Super Fleek, and I was trying to inflate him and make him more important because I wanted them to pay attention to him. And it's good to experiment with your game and to try to see what works and to also experiment, but you should also pay attention to whenever you decide to make elements bigger just because people aren't paying attention to it the way you want it. Because what I ended up doing was making, or rather forcing players to deal with Super Fleek. And it wasn't apparent to me until much, much later. So we went from the Super Fleek's mom's house to I made him a random encounter. So whenever you've landed on the encounter space, a card could tell you that you have to deal with Super Fleek. And then changed it so that, you know, you had a whole pizza movement system, because I said, okay, maybe the movement system's the problem, not Super Fleek. Maybe if I make 3 different types of pizza and the pizza changes how he moves, that will be more interesting. Like I went, I jumped hoops to try and incorporate Super Fleek into my game. He went from a pawn to a card to like an instant play card that players had to react to, and the pizza became cards that players had to collect to try and manipulate him, and none of it worked. It was just like, to my first question, or my second question on, is this mechanic controversial? If your playtesters are split between, oh man, I love this, and nah, this isn't doing anything for me, or I absolutely hate it, why is it here? Then there's an issue with the mechanic. And I think the initial reaction is to try and get everybody on the, yes, I love this train. But if you have several playtests where it's always divided with how players react to something, then it's probably what the mechanic is trying to do is what they are reacting to, but the mechanic itself is probably not the best fit to do that. And so with Super Fleek, the thing that I learned was that they were reacting to the humor of him, the humor in the game, but not what he specifically was doing. And after iteration after iteration, I was able to make Super Fleek basically clip art. And I got rid of almost all of his presence in the game, except for just kind of an Easter egg. Like, if you've played this game a billion times, you know who Super Fleek is, but he no longer had an integral role in the game. And when I finally, a year and a half later, got rid of Super Fleek, I also got rid of a good chunk of my game. Like, I got rid of tokens, movement issues, latency between, or not latency, but downtime between turns. My game sped up because I had been attaching all these different things to that one mechanic and hadn't realized it. And by eliminating that, I suddenly didn't have a need for all the other things that were attached to it. And my game lost probably half of its weight. So let's see if I can switch back to my face. Sorry, I'm looking at the comments. Okay, I apparently can't do the switch without clicking into here. Here we go. Okay. So that was how Super Fleek completely took down my game, and how I transformed it. But when I revisit the questions that I said before, is like, why did I create this mechanic? I created Super Fleek because I wanted something that created a gotcha moment for players. I wanted something that moved on its own and created excitement on the board. That was the initial thing. And as I iterated, the question, is this mechanic controversial? Yes, it is. Again, players couldn't decide between loving it, hating it, or being absolutely neutral to it. So that's why I examined it. The next question was, is the current version of the mechanic doing that? And at the time, no, it wasn't. Every iteration of Super Fleek missed out on being able to create gotcha moments. Players just weren't interested in him. Players didn't want to interact with him. They could go the whole game without interacting with him. If I integrated him with cards, they chose not to collect his cards. If I integrated him as a pawn, then he was avoided, or he was inconsequential. They're just like, I got hit by Super Fleek. Mildly annoying. Okay. Hi, Debbie. So he wasn't accomplishing what I wanted. And honestly, I was the only person that really wanted him in the game that badly. So that comes to my fourth question of, is there a better way to achieve the original idea? And for me, it took a long time to get to that point. And part of that was because it was my first game. But what I realized was that in trying to get player interaction, I was giving way too much variety in my games. I was kind of coming from a background of playing Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh! And so it was familiar to me to have cards with different effects that you put on the field all the time, and you adjust it to it. But for the type of game that I was creating, which was geared more towards casual players, I realized that that would be really frustrating if every time a new card was played, the rules of the game essentially changed. And so by realizing that, I took, like I said, I scrapped Super Fleek, but I scrapped 2 entire decks from my game and changed them so that all of the characters were their abilities were much more consistent. I narrowed down how many abilities there were for players to deal with, and I also made it feel like players could have a grasp on the game within the first 2 rounds. And by doing that, I was able to increase the player interactivity because suddenly they could really move and strategize in the game. No, nobody loved it, Nether. They could move and strategize in the game. And that was what really gave my game life. Superfleek, like I said, lived on as a good Easter egg, and I would love to show you, but I feel like I haven't I haven't mastered flipping back and forth between screen share and my video, so I'm just gonna talk it out. So I'm going to recenter. With game design, something that I enjoy doing is developing. I really enjoy playtesting, the playtesting part of game design. And yes, Pam, I find that keeping a diary has really helped with reflecting. From the very start, I kept a diary for my board game on BGG. And I did that, 1, because I have a terrible memory, and 2, because I wanted to be able to look back and see how things changed. And kind of it allowed me to process the changes in my game as well as the feedback that I got. For Book of Villainy, I would write down and blog about the changes I made in the game, but after I went to certain conventions, I would also put the feedback there. I would kind of separate it by the good, the bad, and what changes I wanted to put in. And by doing that, it helped kind of cement the steps I was taking towards my design, and it kind of gave me direction, especially when I hit walls. And when I hit like the huge creative walls that kept me away from the game for like, say, a couple of weeks or a month, it's easy to forget where you were when you're like in your kind of crazed game design brain. But I would go back to my diary, and it would be really easy to kind of slip back into that mindset because I was very detailed with why I made choices and my thought process behind my designs. So, as a playtester, I find that playtesting other people's games has been really essential for helping me refine my own games. Because as I'm looking at the things in their game and using the cards and kind of feeling how it feels to be the player, it helps me to internalize that and then kind of utilize that in my own designs. I also find that by kind of chewing on a prototype for long enough, I'm able to get a new perspective on games that I'm playing, or I'm usually looking at it in odd ways. And so when I ask certain questions, a lot of times I might get a pause from the designer because maybe no one has brought it up before. Or if they brought it up, maybe they didn't word it in the way that I worded it. And so it helps kind of turn the image of their own prototype, and they can consider it in a new way. And I think that's my favorite part of game design, is when I'm able to do that as a designer, is, get just the right question, and suddenly the problem I'd been having is revealed because somebody phrased it to me in a way that was different from how I'd been considering it. I mentioned before that, Superfleek was an element of my game that I held on to, but there are a lot of things that you can do to see if something is there because it needs to be, or if you're possibly getting attached to a part of your game that isn't integral to the gameplay or to the other players. It's very human to get attached to things in your game, and again, I'm susceptible to it and definitely do it even knowing what to look out for. But my habits that I've noticed, and hopefully this will help you maybe identify your own habits, is if I start justifying a mechanic, that might be like a small flag. For example, with Superfleek, I was just like, well, he's hilarious, and if I just make a small tweak, it'll be fine. So if you find yourself tweaking a particular mechanic like every other iteration, it might be that you're kind of justifying why it should be there, because it's probably not doing what you originally put it in there for. Another thing that I found myself doing was making reactionary adjustments. And that is, so I've spoken before on having finding the core to your game and sticking to that, because whenever you are getting feedback from so many different people and so many different places, it's very easy to get lost in game design and kind of lose the identity of your game. And for me, that was a big source of creative block. But something that I would do would be make reactionary adjustments based off of what one playtester said, without necessarily considering the big picture. And it's kind of like the more focused that you get on a particular mechanic in your game, your vision focuses, you get tunnel vision, the harder it is to see how that helps the entirety of your game, because you're so invested on just kind of making this one thing work. And the less it works, the more you kind of double down on it. And that's what I was doing. I was trying to avoid that negative feedback. So I was like, if I just make this one part feel good, everything else will follow. But this one part was like the smallest thing in my game, and I just kept blowing it up and making it bigger and bigger so that it meant more to players, and therefore I made it a huge part of my game, and therefore I added a giant load of bloat to my game. So it can start very small. Again, Superfleek was just going to be one AI that floated around and boop, he bumped your player. But when my board went from its Monopoly layout to the space theme layout to the tiles, he also changed. And by changing him to fit these different layouts, I had to add things, and it just slowed everything down. Another thing that I did was that I made the thing that wasn't working more important, and essentially forced it on the player. And not to repeat myself, but I've noticed that also in other prototypes where you make a thing mandatory. Like Superfleek was something that a player had to deal with at some point, where they had to collect something in order to not get some super negative thing to happen to them. Because I was like, if I make it a part of the rules that you have to pay attention to this thing or you suffer, then clearly players will get it and realize this is a cool thing and I should pay attention to it. It doesn't work that way. Players will just get annoyed. Like, I really wish that this wasn't happening. It doesn't do anything for the experience. So those were my bad habits. And when I notice that I'm doing them, that's when I have to reassess and say, okay, why did I put this in here? is it doing the thing that I put it in there for? No. Okay, is there a better way to do this? Okay. So, and again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. So I'm going to try and switch my screen again. Hold on. Oops. So hopefully it has switched properly. Let's check. Okay. So for my board, if you can see, I got this space looking board when I was trying to figure out the movement of my game. And another thing that I kind of kept in my game for a while was the central prison to punish players. And it took probably, I want to say five or six iterations before I got rid of that as well. And that was more of me trying to figure out how to get players to move, because I was new to game design. But I was really attached because my very first iteration, it always had a central prison. So that could also be something, something that's part of your original game design that you kind of keep, because that's your focus. It's kind of what you build off of. And visually, mine was always having a centered area that players were trying to avoid. But as I found the identity of my game, and I reaffirmed what the core of my game was, which is the drama and the interaction between players, the humor, that was what I was going for. I realized what did and didn't work. And the prison eventually got faded out. A lot of things did. Let me see if you can see on this page. So I'm hoping that you can see the different iterations, because I uploaded a bunch of them all at once. Let's see if they're, yes, okay, they're showing now. So I mentioned them before when my screen was not sharing, but Book of Villainy started out with just this roll and move mechanic where players were going around collecting different outfits for their villains, and you know, they were trying to create the coolest villain and eventually get enough points to get the Book of Villainy. And it went from this very abstract kind of hexagon, octagon, to this very spacey, flower-looking black and purple thing at the very bottom. And I got rid of that because players could not read it, could not understand where you were supposed to move. I just, you know, I came from an art background. I thought it looked pretty. I evolved to this Monopoly board with a center area. So it was Monopoly, but with two areas, and you could move down into the center and interact with different things on the board. And then we moved to hexes, to this other space board with a bunch of different dots. There is an unpictured board with hand-drawn circles all over it, and that lasted for exactly one convention. And eventually I landed on these tiles. I had to throw away a lot of things in my game, but I threw them away, and then I found ways to redo the ideas. So if movement didn't work for me, like the roll and move didn't work for me, and I was trying to figure out how to let players move, that's how I came to the hex. Because to me, the hex just gave you so many options to go places, but that still didn't inform how players should move. And eventually I moved up to this other space-board in the corner, and the spaces were labeled, and players had their own little areas for things that they were collecting, but it still didn't allow players to flow whenever between turns. They didn't know what they were doing, and while they would be like, oh, I had fun, at the end of the day, it all was very random. So the thing that I was iterating for was trying to make things feel tight, and to also try and figure out what movement felt natural to what I was trying to create, and that's how I came to these tiles. And I'm showing the iterations because I feel like it is a good example of when I was able to let go of bloat. Like Superfleek was the piece of bloat I couldn't let go of, and I didn't even realize had become bloat. But the other parts, I was able to see very clearly that it wasn't working, and discard it. So let's look at for a long time, whenever I was on, let's see if I can make it bigger. When I was on this space-board, I had pawns on there. Players had minions. The villains had minions that they had to move around. And they also had a couple of cards that they were trying to collect. They had inventions they were trying to build. It was a lot going on. And what I found was that players weren't interested in inventions, or rather, they were interested in the set collection, but not the inventions themselves. It was too hard, especially when you're trying to kind of worry about area control with all these spaces. It was way too many options for the player. Games dragged on way too long. And let's see. Over here at the top, you can see this 1 through 10 meter, which was a player's reputation. So villains not only had powers, but they also had reputation that you had to balance, as well as all these locations, which there's zero indication of what they mean or what they do. And I cut all of it. It to me, it looked pretty, but it is a literal visual mess for user interface and usability, as well as accessibility. So I was able to cut those and go backwards, or rather move forward into this grid, which I'll give that time to load. Let me check and see if there are any other questions. Oh, there are a lot of questions. Okay, so give me a second to look at these. I'm so sorry. I have to flip back and forth between the tabs in order to see the chat. Okay, so Christian said, so finding the balance between sticking to your theme and not getting married to a thing that doesn't work is playtesting, and if you find something always needs to change, it's probably bad for the game. Yes. So again, it's cool if you're testing a thing, it doesn't work, and you tweak it a couple of times. But if you notice, like over the span of a couple of months, that you've been tweaking and tweaking this thing, and it still hasn't sat quite right with your game, then that probably means that it's no longer doing what you intended to do, and it probably could be replaced by something that is a little bit stronger. or a better fit for your game. So it may not be that what you're trying to do is wrong for your game, but it just may be the execution. So then just play with other ideas or other ways that you could execute that same thing and test that out. And also, that's a good point to ask playtesters, did this mechanic stand out to them? Or, why didn't they engage with it? And if they were to engage with something like that, what would tempt them to do it? And if they aren't interested in that mechanic at all, even in the ideal scenario, then that might be a time to say, okay, maybe my game doesn't need that because they enjoy my game for X, Y, and Z reason. But you may also get some really cool ideas from playtesters about why or why something may or may not work, or a better way that you could implement that. Let's see. Emily asked, how did the first playtest without Superfleet go? So, I started Book of Villainy in 2017, and I didn't do a playtest without Superfleet probably until late 2018, maybe right before I got it signed. And technically, again, Superfleet's in there, he's just Easter egg, he's just a photo. But the first test without Superfleet was excellent because players weren't worried about him, and Superfleet was just a usable card that would help players get their objectives done. So it went absolutely well. Like I said, just eliminating Superfleet got rid of so many components of my game. I had probably a 10 or 12 page rule book, and when I got rid of Superfleet and all the things that trailed with him, it went down to about a 4 or 5 page rule book, which it's gotten even smaller now. But that initial cut my rule book in half. That's how much he was adding to my game. Like, this one part that shouldn't mean anything, he was adding a lot of if-thens. It was just like, if you have this pepperoni pizza and Superfleet hits you, then Superfleet freezes this player for 2 turns. But if you have the cheese pizza and you hit Superfleet with that, then Superfleet takes away an evil deed. Or it was just like, I did a lot of if-thens and situationals that really had to be explained out in the rule book, and it was a mess. For Heather, you created a detailed BGG design journal. Cool to be able to look back over it, knowing where it ended up. Yes, it is very cool. And actually, I spent today looking over it, and there was some things that I had done to the game that I had completely forgotten, which, as I mentioned before, I have a terrible memory, which was the first motivation. But I highly recommend creating a designer diary, because it is, 1, amazing as a scrapbook for your game's growth, and 2, a great motivator, and 3, a great way to kind of keep on track with what you chose to put in your game, why you chose to do that, and like the identity of the game that you're trying to protect. So highly recommend that. For Sarah, what are your thoughts about punishing players? So I find that punishing players is a bit of a barrier. On the one hand, I grew up playing mass market games that punish players, and I absolutely loved it. Playing Monopoly, playing Risk, and just, playing the game until nobody's left standing but myself. Ruthless. But, that doesn't tend to be good to get other people to play games with you. 1 second, because of course I would. So yeah, that doesn't tend to be good to get people to play with you, and also it's not great for getting casual players into games. if you are punishing players, I think that you need to punish equally. So it's something that everyone can be hit by and not something that skill will divide the punishment by. So if a experienced player is playing with a new player and the experienced player knows how to get around this punishment or to deflect the punishment towards other players, you can have a really lopsided situation where, you know, new players are at a huge disadvantage. And for me, I like it if both experienced and new players have a fighting chance. So for my personal designs, I try to mitigate the punishment to something that is equal among all players and not just experience based, if that makes sense. But I think that for more complex games or heavier games, that's probably all right. I mean, yeah, it's fine, and you know, you can build up that punishment and balance it. But I think in a lighter game that plays relatively quickly, it can end up being a little bit too take that, and that's something that I kind of wanted to avoid, because I play with all types of people who I would like to play with again. So, any more questions? Go ahead and put those in the chat, and I will switch back to this and switch back to the chat when I'm done. Okay. So, these are the 9 tiles that I created for Book of Villainy. And you can see kind of the villain on the side, but the entire layout changed. I made everything kind of cards based instead of having pawns, so that also cut out components. The pawns and also the pizza tokens that I created. Instead, I just had these little red bits over here that I call lies, and I had goals for players to complete. But it was still a little bit much. Like, you see, 6 decks plus this display of cards up top, plus the villain cards, and it's, for me, it's still a lot. So with the help of a lot of playtesting, I was able to trim that down. As you can see, also, I tried to console myself by making Super Fleek a part of my sell sheet, and that didn't last long because someone pointed out that it looked like he didn't have pants, and really it was just that his belly was covering a good majority of his pants. You see that little patch right there? But that was enough to get me to remove Super Fleek from my sell sheet, and back to clip art in one of my cards. So, you know, I tried. I did try. Hold on. Okay, I thought I got a new. So, as far as game bloat, again, whenever you are designing, something that you want to really pay attention to is how players interact with your game. I've seen some designers kind of go into a playtest with a mindset of how they want players to interact with their game, and they'll kind of coach like, oh, you can do this or you should do that. But I find it helpful to, you know, explain the game and then let players do what they're inclined to do. And if they have questions, definitely answer them. But it can reveal a lot if you find that players naturally gravitate towards elements in your game that you weren't paying attention to, or if they want to do a strategy that you didn't know existed or didn't think was optimal. If they're gravitating to doing that, there must be a reason. Like, it's built into the game. Like, for me, I found out the hard way that my game allowed people to turtle for way too long. And so a game with aggressive players would take 40-45 minutes, but with players who wanted to be more defensive and kind of build up their resources, that game took 2.5 hours. And then we still ended it early. And you have to realize that while certain things in your game may feel nice, you want only the best things for your game still in it at the end of your design journey. Not that you never really reach the end, but at the end of the day, you want your game to be as slimmed down as possible. So there will be a lot of good things that are in your game, but by figuring out which one of those good things you can cut, you can end up making other parts of your game feel great. So, after you're deeper into your development, it's definitely helpful to see, what do other players find great about this? Like, out of all the things, what's the one thing that they would keep? Or what's the one thing they kept doing? Because that must be for a reason. What's the thing they kept ignoring? Because it can be easy to kind of miss that, because maybe you think, well, that's just not the strategy they chose to use. But sometimes the design choices force strategies or force decisions that seem like strategies, but really it was the only option that players saw. And it's important to identify those points in your game, because that means it can be tightened up. Let me see. Let's see the chat. How to watch players play without your help. And designers giving advice on the game strategies. Yeah. I've seen many designers giving advice on game strategies, and even people teaching games that do that. And, I feel if a game allows me to do a thing, then I should be able to do the thing. So just really allow playtesters to do what they instinctually want to do when they play your game. And also something that I found super helpful was writing down everything that my playtesters said. And I mean, I've had some pretty heinous things said to me, some pretty off-the-wall things said to me. I wrote them all down. And I would say maybe 25% of that, actually, I went back on it and it was absolutely relevant and helpful to my game. It can be very easy in the moment, when you're focusing so much on your game or that experience, to miss what somebody is saying or to misunderstand what they're saying. Me personally, I find it hard to process right at a playtesting table, because my mind is like thinking through so much and going through, just interacting with human beings, and I can't digest what was said and go through the logic of it and then, say, oh yeah, that makes sense, and, debate it back and forth. Some designers can do that. They could say, oh yeah, well, what if I do this? I can't do that on the spot. But what I can do is write down everything and then give myself about 24 hours or an hour, however long, to chill out. And then I go back to what I wrote. And again, that is why the designer diary is so very helpful. But I also keep notebooks as well. But going back to those and then really thinking through them, thinking through why did the player say that, and what would my game look like if I did that? Would that align with how I originally saw the core of my game? Would that help make it stronger? Was there a point to what they said? Maybe. Like, some things I just didn't like it. I didn't want to hear it. I wasn't ready to hear it. But 3 months later I was, and it was written right there. So playtesters will identify the bloat. They may not say it bluntly. They may not, present it to you in a way that is easy to digest. But if you let them do what they're inclined to do, their gameplay will also reveal the bloat in your game. So that is pretty much, I think, my thoughts on how to identify bloat. But I would absolutely love to answer any more questions, and if not, then I think I will end the video. Oh, there is a lot more. It can be easy to be a bad influence about this as a playtester if you ask too many strategy questions. It makes it hard for the designer to stay quiet because they don't want to seem unhelpful. Yes, it can definitely, if I've had playtesters ask strategy questions, and sometimes I would try to keep it open-ended, but with very analytical players, that can be very frustrating. So that comes with kind of understanding your playtesters. If the playtester actually wants to be told what's a good option, then I have a good standard set of, these are things that you can do. All of these are viable, and these are what your options are right now in this turn. And then leave them with those options. If they ask me, what's a typical strategy that you've seen for the game, I would answer that too. I found that I was most resistant to answering that when I kind of got the inkling that I maybe had a very, not broken, but part of my game was very loose. And so by answering, oh, well, this strategy is used the most often, then I had to kind of be introspective and say, why is that? Does that mean that the other strategies aren't as viable? But that was again one of my personal things when I was kind of dragging my feet on making big changes in the game. But I think that there's definitely a way, if there are players that want to know a strategy, to answer that. I just don't want to force a strategy on all players. So if a player, is just only interested in the set collection, be interested in the set collection. You don't have to worry about the other strategies. Let's see how just doing that affects your gameplay. Emily asks, did I pitch bloated iterations? I actually did not pitch Book of Villainy until about a year and a half into its making. And that was after I had gotten it down to the tiles. And it was still a little bit bloated. But it was definitely after I had cut Super Fleek. So I didn't have the confidence to pitch Book of Villainy for a long time. Again, it was my very first game, so I'm a bit unique in that situation. But it was my very first game, and I was learning about the board game industry. And, I'd seen other designers kind of chewed up, spit out whenever they went to a publisher talk. Because probably they were approaching a publisher that was tired at the end of the day, or, a publisher that was absolutely not looking for the type of game that they were trying to pitch. Who knows? But I had seen those kind of interactions, and so had decided that I was absolutely not going to put myself in the line of fire until I felt a little bit more confident about my game. And it wasn't until I had slimmed it down, because I had done game contests, and the game contest was definitely bloated. It still had the pizza tokens. I still have the little quick play of Book of Villainy on my BGG work in progress page, which I should probably replace because people think that's how you play my game now. But yes, Super Fleek was my security blanket. And once I got rid of him, I was just like, if it's not ready to pitch now, when is it? Um, and so I went to a speed dating pitching event, and and it also, I didn't know any publishers. And it was at the point where I didn't really know people at conventions. I only went to conventions in Georgia, and half of them were anime conventions. So it was just, it was an entire journey with Book of Villainy. But by the time I had gotten rid of Superfleek, and I also felt confident explaining my game, giving the elevator pitch for it, because previous to that, I kept switching up what the setting was for the city. I almost went to kind of a Mansions of Madness sort of inside of a house, and then it was a junkyard, and it was just a lot. But I finally got it down to, in Book of Villainy, you're a villain, but you're not very good at it. So you're making a book about being a villain instead. And I was like, that's it. Okay, got it. And I was able to get down, my pitch to a minute, and talk it through to people. Why did I do this? Okay, 1 second. This is what you get. Okay, so I definitely, have slimmed down Book of Villainy since I initially pitched it, but actually, I was able to get Book of Villainy signed from that very first speed pitching event. So I think that the game was ready and I was ready, and that was good luck on my side. As for future games, I will try not to pitch bloated iterations. It's kind of hard to see it in the moment, but if I feel like it's bloated, if I feel like it could be slicker, move faster, it's not at its ideal time, then I'm probably not going to pitch it. At least not formally. Hope that answers your question. And okay, I think I've reached my hour, and I believe it's only supposed to be an hour long. So I will end it here, but thank you very much for tuning in for my talk and my technical difficulties. Sorry about that. I will get better with that. But I enjoyed it, and I will hopefully see you guys in the future. Bye.